PowerPoints to beyondcreationscience.com. If you're watching online, or if you want to see a little bit better, more crisp presentation of the PowerPoints. What's that?
Here.
Okay.
The senior citizen section.
Okay, so is that better? A little bit better? Okay, so the PowerPoints are on the website yesterday, so that you can have those available. So beyondcreationscience.com, you just click the link for this presentation, you'll go straight to those options for those listening online, or if you want to do that here as we go. As by way of introduction, my name is Tim Martin, co-author with Jeff Vaughn of Beyond Creation Science, which has been out since the first edition since 2001, but the current third edition is a 2007 release. So I know Michael's presented that book here and talked about it, others have seen discussion about it. My presentation today, I don't really get invited a lot to these things, so at least not in the last 10 or 15 years. So I try to pack lots of stuff together, and this has been a lot of work over many years being thrown together. But I find it too is 20 years ago, I went to my first conference. I was invited to Sparta, North Carolina, John Anderson, and there I met a Mr. Claire Chandler. Might bring back some memories from everybody here, but that was 20 years ago, give or take, and it was a good time. So my presentation today is really the third edition, the third part of a four-part series, and I'm going to start in a way that it doesn't matter if you've seen the first two presentations, but I did get the first two presentations in September in St. Louis. So the message today is Adam, the first son, Genesis, the first Bible. And I think which had to do with covenant population in the Bible. And then part two, a history of the covenant universe. And all that material is available online as well. Well, the covenant creation model, to give you a basic introduction, is this idea that the Genesis creation is structured in such a way that it is a temple text. And so you have the full temple architecture of heaven, earth, and sea in Genesis chapter 1. Well, let's see here. Sorry, I'm using new technology, so I'm learning something here as we go. Okay, gotcha. Okay, and then Genesis 2:4 takes a different text, which is focused more on the priestly and Adamic context, which has the name for Israel's Yahweh, as opposed to Elohim in Genesis chapter 1. And you know what? I can't even. I'm so small on this. Is there a way for me to use that at all? Because I can't hardly even. This is so small on my screen. I don't even have a.
Sideways.
Why'd you take
I wanted to turn this on.
Sorry about that. So Genesis scholarship is actually going in the direction of showing a close identification of creation with temple. And that's really good news because we understand that the new creation in Jesus is the new temple. And that is showing that we're seeing a parallel from creation onto eschatology. Now, the example that I started off with in my first presentation was the Genesis curse in Genesis chapter 3. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the fruit of the field. Genesis 3:17-18. This has tremendous implications for civilization as far as worldview goes, because many people view the world through this text. But does this refer to the material creation as related to rocks, birds, trees, and sticker bushes? Well, the very same elements come up in, if you look at the parallel, Hebrews chapter 6, you'll see, for the earth which drinks in the rain that often comes upon it and bears herbs useful for those to whom it is cultivated, receives blessing from God. But if it bears thorns and briars, it is rejected and near to being cursed, whose end is to be burned. That's in Hebrews chapter 6. Now, this language is the very same language from Genesis chapter 3, but it's also put in the context of Deuteronomy 32, which says, Moses saying, give ear, O heavens, I will speak, and hear, O the words of my mouth. Let my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, as raindrops on the tender earth, and as showers on the grass. So in Hebrews, you have a Deuteronomic choice, blessings and cursings, but it's academic in the language that it's used. And of course, in the end, they will be burned. So we see here the writer combines Adam and Israel as a unified whole in the eschatological announcement. We understand what this is referring to. Thorns are people, we would say covenant apostates, and the herbs are people representing covenant faithful. Like the language of the Old Testament is all flesh is grass. Surely the people are grass, for example. You compare that to the parable of the wheat and the tares, with grain being the crop, the faithful who are gathered into God's barn. The weeds are the apostates to be burned at the harvest at the end of the age. So the story begins with God's planting of good seed, and then an enemy who planted weeds came in. So Israel's story, when Jesus is giving the parable of wheat and tares, is really going back and telling the story of Adam. So we can see this in the Old Testament with the language. We see in Ezekiel, and he said to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them, nor be afraid of their word. Though briars and thorns are with you, you dwell among scorpions. Do not be afraid of their words or dismayed by their looks, though they are a rebellious house. Or you see also, behold, I am against you, O Sidon, and there shall no longer be a prickly briar or painful thorn for the house of Israel among all who are around them, who despise them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. In Ezekiel, that passage, the nations around Israel become the thorns and the briars. Micah gives an example. The best of them is like a briar. The most upright is sharper than a thorn hedge. The day of our watchman and your punishment comes. Now shall be their perplexity. So we see in the Old Testament prophetic use of that language from Genesis chapter 3. Briars and thorns are related specifically to Adam, Israel. In that day, sing to her a vineyard, Israel, of red wine. The Lord keep it. I water it every moment, lest any hurt it. I keep it night and day. Fury is not in me. Who would set briars and thorns against me in battle? I would go through them. I would burn them together. Isaiah chapter 27. Of course, we know the context for Isaiah chapter 27. Jesus uses this language as well. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Speaking about the Pharisees, the Judaizers, the Zealots, the Herodians. Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. John the Baptist used that imagery of the axes laid at the root of the trees. So briars and thorns related specifically to Adam and Israel, and I would suggest the new covenant is redemption from the curse. A quote from James B. Jordan, thorns threatened to choke out good plants. Cain succeeded in choking out Abel, the bad plant murdering the good. The seed of the daughters of men overwhelmed and almost completely choked out the good seed. Crowned with thorns, the greater Abel was surrounded by evil Cains in his sacrificial death. Now, what is the new covenant? What's the promise of the new covenant? But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. Law in their minds and write it in their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, said the Lord. Jeremiah chapter 31. Comes up again in Revelation. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. Literally, it's the accursed ones. There will be no more accursed ones in the New Jerusalem, and that's parallel to his servants shall serve him. So here's the bigger picture of the covenant context of the curse. The old covenant heavens and earth, Eden, Jerusalem, was perpetually plagued by covenant apostates due to Adam's sin. The language there is thorns and thistles. That would be the old covenant creation. That would be the natural creation. The new covenant, new heavens and earth, the Eden, New Jerusalem, has no covenant apostates. In the Garden of Eden, Adam or New Jerusalem, Israel, is restored through Christ. So the new covenant creation is spiritual. And that makes it a better covenant. Now, to contrast this, I was assuming that we preterists had talked about Romans chapter 8, and it's not about rocks and the birds and the sticker bushes when it comes to Paul's theology of redemption of the sons of God. But actually, this is a contrast with a recent sermon from David Curtis on Genesis chapter 3 from September 24th. And he laid out a very biological view of thorns and thistles. And I just present this as a contrast or just different demonstration of different methods. Pastor Curtis asked, did the punishment God gave to Adam and Eve have everlasting effects? Are they all continue? Do they all continue to this day? He says Adam was in the garden in Eden. It is this beautiful garden full of fruits and vegetables, but now the ground is cursed, and now there is going to be problems raising food, and God made his life very hard. Man's life in regard to this. No more easy, in the garden they're just picking fruit and the trees. They're just enjoying life. Now it's going to be hard. Now it's going to be painful labor, working the ground among thorns and thistles to find enough to keep you alive. Yes, the Lord returned in AD 70, and yet the ground curse still is in effect. So his conclusion was, when you live your life dedicated to Christ, seeking to walk in the Spirit, honor God, all your decisions you make and everything that is your life, it's going to be a blessed life, even though the curse is still there. That's my take on it, people. I think the curse still exists. Now, that's a biological view of the curse. What it's saying is that the original creation God made in Genesis 1, taken as a literal, physical reality, is no longer the same as how God made it in the beginning. And when you add preterism to that, you get a preterist biological curse view. The curse remains on the ground forever. And so the preterist biological curse view, Adam's sin is in history, is ultimately greater than Jesus's redemption in history. So a preterist biological curse view, as is demonstrated here, would be a failed redemption in Christ. The curse goes forever and ever. Adam is greater than Jesus when it comes to the effects of Adam's sin. Now, here's a quote that sort of gives you a background on the first two presentations from G.K. Beale. He says, the reason that Jesus reflects both the Old Testament figures of Adam and Israel is because, as we have seen earlier, Israel and her patriarchs were given the same commission as was Adam in Genesis 1:26 and 28. Consequently, it is not an overstatement to understand Israel as a corporate Adam. Have you heard about corporate idea of Adam? Who had failed in their Garden of Eden in much the same way as their primal father had failed in the first garden. For these reasons, it is understandable that Jesus is called Son of God, partly because that was the name for the first Adam, and for Israel. Likewise, the expression Son of Man from Daniel 7:13 refers to end-time Israel, representative king, as the son of Adam, who was sovereign over the beasts. Recall, the Son of Man takes over the kingdoms of former evil empires portrayed as beasts. And we saw in our earlier presentations that's rooted in Genesis chapter 2. Understandably, against this background, it is natural that the Son of Man, Adam, became one of Jesus' favorite ways of referring to himself. We see Adam and Israel combined in the law. He found him in a desert land and in the wasteland, as an eagle stirs up its nest, hovers over its young, Deuteronomy 32. David Chilton says, Moses uses two key words in the passage, waste and hour. Both of these words occur only one other time in the entire Pentateuch, and again they occur together in Genesis 1:2. Waste is used to describe the uninhabitable condition of the earth as it at its creation without form, and hover is Moses' term for the Spirit's activity of moving in creative power over the face of the deep. God is not careless with language. The covenant on Sinai was a recreation or reorganization of the world. Similarly, St. John borrows terminology from the same passage in Moses to present that message to the church. God has brought to fulfillment the provisional recreations of the old order. The coming of Christ has brought about the definitive recreation, new covenant. We see all these different old covenant things going back to Genesis. You see the feast in Genesis chapter 1, the seasons that God made. The Sabbath is introduced in Genesis 2. Sacrifice is introduced by Genesis 4. Clean and unclean animals are known by Noah in Genesis 6. Abraham tithed to Melchizedek in Genesis 14. Abraham kept all of God's commandments, statutes, and laws in Genesis 25. Levirate marriage was assumed as the background in Genesis chapter 38. Moses judged by God's statutes and laws before Sinai. And Jesus holds this generation accountable for all the blood shed on earth from Abel. So creation and covenant are united. The theology can be put again by James Jordan. Theologians sometimes use Old Covenant to refer to the Mosaic Covenant. There is truth in this, in that the Mosaic Covenant published most fully the distinctive character of the Adamic Covenant under curse. Yet ultimately, the Old Covenant is the covenant of the original Garden of Eden. Ultimately, there are two covenants, old and new. There are two Adams, Adam and Jesus. There are two heavens and earth, first in Adam and the second in Christ. My next presentation deals with more implications of that theology. We see this also presented by Don Breskin, where he says, first and foremost, the undeniable fact that Paul, when considering the resurrection from the death of Adam, posited that the resurrection as fulfillment as God's promises to Old Covenant Israel. He directly cites Isaiah 25 and Isaiah 13, not to mention the fact that he indirectly alludes to Daniel 9, Daniel 12, and the Psalms, and other Old Testament prophecies. 1 Corinthians 15. This means that the promise of resurrection made in the garden is incorporated into Yahweh's promises to Old Covenant Israel. So the story of the garden becomes the story of Israel. And I would say the garden, we're talking about Adam, so the story of Adam becomes the story of Israel. And you see the way the prophets present this. Ezekiel chapter 13 has this long story of the lifespan of Israel, and it shows Israel beginning as a baby when God said, live, and it took its first breath. Sinai is the betrothal covenant. Out of Israel, the prophets, we see Hosea say, but like Adam, they, that's Israel, transgressed the covenant there. They dealt treacherously with me. It's the beginning of Israel. Your first father sinned, and your mediators have transgressed against me. Israel has many fathers, but your first father sinned. We call them the patriarchs, plural. For behold, I create new heavens and new earth, and the former shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem as a rejoicing, and her people a joy. So we have creation and Israel brought together in Isaiah 65. By the way, that's the same language from Genesis chapter 1. The future. So there's a connection. Now, in the Gospels, this idea of new creation is way bigger than we realize. John 1, many people have noticed, and lots of theologians have talked about, in the beginning language in John chapter 1. But there are actually 6 days of the ministry of Christ in the choosing of his 12 disciples. 12 disciples relate to Israel. But there's 6 days in the opening of John's gospel. So the idea of creation and Exodus are actually put together. It's absolutely amazing. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Day 1, light. Day 2, the next day, I did not know him, but that he should be. So day 2 was a baptism with John. Waters separated, matching day 2 of creation. Day 3 says the next day. Now when Jesus looked at him, he said, "You are Simon, son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated stone. So there's the earth of day 3 in reference in John's gospel. Day 4, the following day, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses, the law, and also prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree," Israel, imagery of Israel, "I saw you." Nathanael answered and said to him, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And that matches day 4, which follows up, is related to the Mosaic Davidic kingdom. Day 5, related to Gentiles, is skipped entirely in John's Gospel because it goes on the third day, day 6, there was a wedding in Canaan. Now there were 6 water pots of stones according to the manner of purification of the Jews. That would be the Old Covenant. Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests had drunk, then inferior. You have kept the good wine, the new covenant, until now. So we have a marriage of Canaan being man and woman representing day 6. And then the very next story in John is the Sabbath. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing business When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple. That's the same word in the LXX is used with God driving Adam out of the garden. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." So Sabbath, temple are all connected in that Sabbath day. John's introduction of Jesus follows the pattern of Genesis creation, temple dedication, and Sabbath as the goal, conclusion, and priority. By the way, this is out of place. If you look at the other gospels, cleansing of the temple at the end of his ministry, it's like John grabs that historical fact, just like distorts it to make his point of the new creation. Mark 1 opens with the beginning and then relates the baptism of Jesus. The heavens torn open and the Spirit is descending on him like a dove. Then records the temptation of Jesus, which follows the precise order of the Spirit hovering in Genesis 1 and the temptation of Adam in Genesis 2 and 3. So the gospel recapitulates the Genesis story with Jesus. Matthew's, the book of the genealogy, Biblios Genealosis, is the same in the LXX, the Septuagint of Genesis 2 and 5 of Jesus Christ. Is listed from David to Abraham, but is artificially structured in a triad set of 14 generations each. There's actually generations missing in that genealogy for a reason. Well, the creation account is a triad, because the days match. So you have this idea of 6 sets of 7 generations from David and Abraham to Jesus. That's actually a structured Genesis creation theme. Luke's genealogy of Jesus is listed to Adam, who is called God's first son of Adam, the son of God. Adam would be the firstborn and heir. G.K. Beale explains it this way: the Gospels portray Jesus as an Adam figure who is inaugurating a new creation, which means there is a new heaven and a new earth, beginning with the gospel. The crucifixion of the Son of Man. How often have you considered that in the context of Genesis? James Jordan explains, here we have the introduction to Herod. Herod the Great is the climax in one way of the entire history of Adam. Herod had been made a king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 39 BC. Thus, the use of the title King of the Jews for Jesus by Pilate, highlighted in all 4 Gospels, shows Christ as the replacement for Herod. So there you have 2 King of the Jews in the Gospel. But that is the climax of the story of Adam, which brings that Jewish context in. Jesus was tempted in the Garden of Gethsemane, like Genesis 2. Jesus sweat great drops of blood. Genesis 3, we have sweat. Crown of thorns, and Golgotha was the place of the skull. Remember, that was the promise. The seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. There's imagery and aesthetic there in the crucifixion of Christ. Romans chapter 8, for the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans with labor, with birth pains, together until now. You can do a very similar presentation on birth pains in covenant context and get the same biblical type of covenant use. N.T. Wright kind of saw this in his theology. He said, second, as far as I'm concerned, actually central for Paul, there is the apostles' understanding of the story of Israel and of the whole world as a single continuous narrative. Paul references to Adam and to Abraham, to Moses and the prophets, to Deuteronomy and Isaiah, and even the Psalms, mean what they mean because he in his head and heart, as a great many Second Temple Jews did, a grand story of creation and covenant of God and his world and his people, which had been moving forward in a single narrative and which was continuing to do so. So we have the story of Adam in Genesis, and I will present to you that the story of Adam in Genesis is really the story of son, firstborn son. So the imagery there, when you read the story, I would suggest to look at that as a child story. Notice in Genesis chapter 1 that Adam is given only herbs for food. Why? Because he's a baby. You don't give meat to babies. Adam's going to grow up and he's going to get meat. In the story of Noah, you have that as well. Adam was born in the wilderness as a baby. The breath of life was put into him, paralleling Ezekiel chapter 16. That's the beginning of his life. The tree of life matches the tabernacle and temple, tree of life being represented by the golden lampstands. Gold and jewels are near Adam and in the holy place as well, and on the high priest's ephod. He's placed in the garden. Israel was made in the wilderness and placed in the promised land. Adam named the animals. So God gave a commission to Adam in Genesis 1:28, and it begins like a father introducing his child to work. So Adam's going to have dominion over the nations, and he's introduced those nations into the garden. It's like a child. When I show up with my kids at work, it's like the squeegee. And the squeegee, right? Name them. Learn the names. And naming has an idea of dominion as well. There's also a deep sleep, which is a rare Hebrew word paralleling Abraham in Genesis 15. Abraham had a deep sleep as well. Adam was cut in half as the covenant was established, and he received the covenant blessings of his wife as a gift from his God. So the problem that Adam had in the garden was like every young man has. How does he get a wife? That is actually parallel with Abraham, who was also concerned about inheritance, who doesn't have a son. So it's the beginning of the Israel story here. Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed. That's how babies come into this world, by the way. And they were, notice that Eve said, you shall, responded by saying, you shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. There's a law background in that, because what does Israel know? That which you do not eat, you do not touch. It is the unclean food. And of course, like babies, what do babies do with everything that they touch? Put it right in their mouth. I have 9 children, so I've seen this a few times. So the story is set up to understand that they're not going to be able to be obedient in their baby condition. And then you have judgment and curse. But here's the interesting, different approach to the curse. Also, Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. We tend to look at that as a sacrificial thing, but actually in the ancient Near East, the ideas of covering is new garments. God made new garments for Adam and Eve in the garden, and the word used in Genesis 3 means royal garments. The high priest removed his old garments of glory and beauty on day 6 of coverings, and then was recovered in them as the new cleansed garments. Throughout human history, clothing is served not only to protect against thorns and thistles, but also as an indicator of one's role of social status. The emphasis here does not fall on sacrifices for their sin. In fact, the skins of sacrificial animals were often burned. Instead, clothing people in the ancient Near East comprised an act of investiture, such as for kings and priests during their installation ceremonies. God's act in Eden pointed to a future for Adam and Eve beyond their misery. His mercy enabled him to accept them despite their fallen state. I want to talk about a worldview application. How do you treat your children when they screw up? God said there are consequences, but then he clothed them in kingly and priestly garments, saying that he's going to fulfill his mission for them. Altars and sacrifice. Abel sacrificed the firstborn of the flock, marks continued worship and continued presence of God with his people during exile from the Garden of Eden. And that parallels Daniel. Daniel goes out into captivity. God goes with them and the young men into Babylon. Commentators have not noticed something very interesting, that the Adamic commission is repeated in direct connection with what looks to be the building of small sanctuaries. Though they build no buildings, these patriarchal sacred spaces can be considered sanctuaries along the lines comparable to the first non-architectural sanctuary in the Garden of Eden. The result of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob building altars at Shechem between Bethel and Ai, Hebron, and near Moriah was that the terrain of Israel's future land was dotted with shrines. Thus, all these smaller sanctuaries pointed to the greater one to come in Jerusalem. The story of Genesis, the story of Exodus, and onward, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, all related in the same story. We see this with a commission that's extended, as we will see after Adam's failure to fulfill God's mandate. God raises up other Adam-like figures to whom his commission is passed on. We will find that the same charges in the commission, some charges in the commission occur as a result of sin entering the world. Adam's descendants, like him, however, will fall. That will continue until there arises a last Adam who will finally fulfill the commission. Some commentators have noticed that Adam's commission is passed on to Noah, to Abraham, and to his descendants. So we see in Hebrews chapter 11, by faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So Hebrews 11 describes the old covenant faithful from creation and Abel as a corporate body of Adam and Israel, as those being perfected together with believers. Lots of parallels here. This is really small type, but I'm having difficulty even seeing it. But Adam and Abraham are very much connected. Abraham was called out of Ur. Adam was created in the wilderness and placed in the land. Abraham possessed much gold. Adam is presented as near gold. Abraham, sorry, it's a little tight. The issue for, hey, that's much. Yep. Abraham deals with nations and animals in the land faithfully and takes nothing from the king of Sodom because they are not people above. Adam is placed. God made animals and brought them to animals to Adam to name and introduce them, and he found them not suitable for helping. Abraham promised a son, undergoes a deep sleep, and God cuts a covenant with promised descendants. Adam undergoes a deep sleep, and God cuts him in two for the blessings of a wife. There's no sacrificial animal needed before sin. Abraham was tempted by his wife to take Hagar to provide an heir and fell. And Ishmael was the result of a household curse or conflict, just like Adam was tempted by his wife. Abraham was blessed with the covenant sign of circumcision to manifest special purpose as God's chosen in spite of failure, and Adam was blessed with royal clothing from God to manifest special purpose. Abraham had Keturah and more children after Isaac was born, and we read in Genesis 5 that Adam had more sons and daughters. So the problem for posterity, had to do with lacking a wife for Adam and then lacking a son for Abraham. Abraham and Noah also have thematic parallels as well, straight out of the text. Both Noah and Abraham represent new beginnings in the course of events recorded in Genesis. Both are marked by God's promise of blessing and his gift of the covenant, according to John 7. Noah is the 10th from Adam. That numerology is really important. Well, guess who's the 10th from Noah? Abraham. So Genesis unfolds as God's son matures. Adam was to rely on God by faith for a wife and for food. He eats the unclean food. Yet we know from the story that Adam was to live by every word that proceeds from God's mouth from the beginning. That's important to understand. Then we have Cain's temptation. He murders his brother in Genesis chapter 4. Noah's temptation, wine from the vineyard, is actually for kings. So the story is coming to a completion, sort of mini completion with Noah. Wine from the vineyard, and he becomes drunk and fails to protect his wife. Abraham's temptation to take Hagar from Sarah's hand for a son rather than listening to the voice of the Lord. Isaac's temptation, he failed to live by faith and to protect Rebekah, Genesis chapter 26. And Jacob's temptation was his children did not exercise justice with Dinah, and the Judah Tamar example of unfaithfulness. These are the children of Jacob. In contrast to that, we have Joseph, the faithful son, the type of Christ. Joseph is the father's beloved son, chosen by his brethren, clothed by Jacob with a tunic of many colors. That is Adamic. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. Sound familiar? Joseph undergoes death, burial, and resurrection with his pit experience, like Jesus. Joseph encounters temptation with Potiphar's wife. Again, he's being tempted by a woman. He succeeds with his temptation by resisting the woman's temptation. He's elevated to the right hand of Pharaoh, who is representative of God of the world. And by the way, when you see Pharaoh in this story, this is the good Pharaoh, right? Because he was a believer. Nebuchadnezzar became a believer later in the Daniel story. So this is not necessarily a bad thing because Pharaoh had the true priest as his right hand. So Joseph prepares grain for the famine and saves both his family, Israel, and the nations around the whole world. And it's difficult for us from an American Western perspective to look at that story with the idea of taxation and servitude and stuff, but understand what they understood. And there, while there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord. We will be Pharaoh's servants." From their perspective, what would have happened if Joseph had not served Pharaoh? They would have all starved. So we tend to look at this as like servitude bad because we're Americans, but in this world, this was a picture of the kingdom of God that would come later in the greater Joseph. So Joseph is seated at the right hand of faithful Pharaoh and provides food for the whole world, which, by the way, reverses the curse where they were going to find in Genesis 3, they're going to eat their bread through difficult pain and toil. Now, we have the idea that they're trading themselves for their food. The whole world serves believing Pharaoh as a picture of God's rule and God's kingdom. Joseph prefigures the completed work of Christ. And my conclusion here is we see the very same story of Genesis starting over again in Exodus chapter 1. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn son. This is, of course, the Pharaoh that Joseph many generations later. So Israel, the heir, is to grow up into maturity as the Adam story continues with Israel. And G.K. Beale puts it this way. Consequently, it is not an overstatement to understand Israel as a corporate Adam. So Israel had Genesis, beginning and end of Genesis, as their entire Bible, in pictures, in types, in shadows, in miniature, as the Exodus story opens. Adam is the first son, and Genesis is the first Bible. Thank you.